Shabbat Shalom, welcome to our home.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome to Shabbat B'Yachad services. We're so glad you're with us tonight. We're going to join together for a nigun, a melody without words. Let's all join in. Now, our special guest tonight at services is Dr. Jackson Katz, who is an expert on masculinity. And we're going to talk about how we can raise nice Jewish boys and turn them into menschlich men who care about themselves and women. And this is a story. This is a way of shaping future generations that's incumbent upon each and every one of us. Parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, mentors, teachers, the way we shape men and women in the future, as well as give them the way to shape themselves, will determine the future not only of the Jewish people, but of all humanity. But it begins by not letting behavior just happen. It means we need to be self-aware and help them be self-aware of how they're acting and sounding, and how they're representing themselves, and how they're stereotyping others. And all of this is applicable not just to women and men, but to different groups, ethnic groups, religious groups. It's a way that we can all live in the world together. Now, it's hard for men to change. We know that. We're stubborn. Just think about how difficult it is for us to ask for directions. So here's a poem that, when you think about it, sounds a lot like us, sounds a lot like men. I walk down the street, there is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in, I am helpless. It's not my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. That was part one. Now here's part two. I walk down the street, there's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend that I don't see it, but I fall in again. I can't believe I am in the same place, but it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Part three. I walk down the street, there is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is there. I still fall. It's a habit. It is my fault. I get out immediately. Part four. I walk down the street, there's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Part five, I walk down another street. You see, we can learn. There is hope for us. We join together for the blessing over the Shabbat candles as our young cantors lead us.
Adonai Eloheinu, Eloheinu, Melech haolam, asher קידשנו במצוותיו ציוונו להדליק נר של שבת.
We continue in our prayer books on page 1, Shalom Aleichem. And if you haven't printed out the prayer book, please do. It's on the homepage, or use another device to follow along. We join together welcoming in Shabbat, Shalom Aleichem.
Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Asharet, Malachei Elyon. Mi Melech Malchei Amlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Boachem leshalom, Malachei Ashalom, Malachei Elyon. מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. מי לשלום, מלכי השלום, מלכי עליון. מי מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. צאתכם לשלום, מלכי השלום, מלאכי עליון. מי מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא.
Please wish those around you Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom.
If you're alone tonight, just reach out to us and wish us Shabbat Shalom. By the way, we've been told people really like it when we do this or this, so
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. So, I've got another reading here. This is one that I used in my letter that I send each Monday. I used this last Monday. It's very powerful, and it describes how all of us need to be in the world. It's a poem by Naomi Shihab Nye, a Palestinian-American poet. A man crosses the street in the rain, stepping gently, looking 2 times north and south, because his son is asleep on his shoulder. No car must splash him. No car must drive too near to his shadow. This man carries the world's most sensitive cargo, but he's not marked. Nowhere does his jacket say, fragile, handle with care. His ear fills up with breathing. He hears the hum of a boy's dream deep inside him. We're not going to be able to live in this world if we're not willing to do what he's doing. We're not going to be able to live in this world with one another. The road will only be wide, and the rain will never stop falling. We join together, bottom of page 1, as we again welcome in this time, not Shabbat in general, but the Shabbat queen that in our tradition we depict as royal. And the queen transforms all of our lives. And if it's better for you to envision a Shabbat king, envision that. And if you don't want to personify Shabbat, think of it as time. And now time passes from mundane, ordinary time into a different zone, a parallel universe, a quieter universe, a relaxed universe, a recreative universe. L'cha dodi.
L'cha dodi, לקראת כלה, עיני שבת, מקבלה. l'cha dodi, לקראת כלה, עיני שבת, מקבלה. שמור וזכור, בדיבור אחד, ישמיענו אל המיוחד, אדוני אחד,
turn to the doorway, we welcome in Shabbat. Think of someone whom you'd like to have with you here tonight, someone living or no longer in life, someone who you'd like to have by your side, celebrating Shabbat. Welcome them in. Boi v'shalom.
בואי ושלום, עטרת בעלן, גם בשמחה ובצהלה, תוך אמוני עם סגולה, בואי חלה, בואי
Our young cantors are going to lead us in Baruch Hu. Please rise. Page 2.
The next poem is by Eve Lyons, and it's called Noah's Wife Talks Back. I don't know what he was thinking. He comes home one evening, announces we have to pack up all our belongings, all our animals, all our family, and build an ark. He said God spoke to him. I said, why now? The world has gotten dark. The world has fallen into violence. The world has succumbed to hatred and fear. I said it has been that way for years. So why now? Why give up now? Why walk out on the world? Why destroy everything rather than start the hard work trying to repair it? He didn't listen. They never listen, these men. They build, they argue, they fight, they destroy and argue some more. Then they take their toys and go home. I don't know whether I'm talking about God or my husband. Some days, they are indistinguishable. In the end, God came around to sing it my way. As soon as the flood waters receded, as soon as the earth dried, as soon as the rainbow appeared, God pledged never to do it again. But it was too late for my neighbors, my friends, my city. Wayward and disturbed, perhaps, but it was my home.
Very powerful, difficult reading. Now, everyone loves the music of Hallelujah. Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah appears everywhere, seemingly everywhere, recorded by other artists, used on television shows and in movies, and it has, interestingly enough, bizarre lyrics. And people, they always remember the melody, and even sometimes they sing the lyrics, but they don't really think about what they're saying. But I want you to consider part of the lyrics about the baffled king. The baffled king in this case was King David. The baffled king didn't understand why he was being so victimized by others. The baffled king who had all this power, in reality, had victimized women, had put soldiers in danger, and a particular soldier, Uriah, who was murdered. And he flung his kingdom, us, the Israelites, flung his kingdom into pain and chaos. But still he always felt baffled. Why is this happening to me? That's the story in Hallelujah. The baffled king who doesn't understand how his power is hurting other people. Our Shul of Rock teen band continues with Hallelujah.
Well, I heard there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord, but you don't really care for music, do ya? Well, it goes like this: the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, and the major lift. The baffled king composing hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Well, your faith was strong, but you needn't prove. You saw her bathing on the roof, her beauty in the moonlight overthrew ya. She tied you to her kitchen chair, she broke your throne and she cut your hair, and from your lips she drew the hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. God above. But all I've ever learned from love was how to shoot somebody who outdrew ya. And it's not the cry that you hear at night. It's not somebody who's seen the light. It's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah. 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 Hallelujah.
We turn to page 4 in our prayer books for Shema. Before we do, let's pause for some moments of kavanah, meditation, silent meditation. If you'd like to close your eyes and take some deep, relaxing Shabbat breaths, please do. Breathing in Shabbat, letting go of the stale air inside. Breathing in Shabbat, newness and transformation. And for the moments of kavanah before the Shema, let's realize that each one of us in our lives is a baffled king or queen. We don't understand the consequences always of our actions. King David needed the prophet Nathan, to say, Ata ha'ish, you are the man. We have to be able to say that to ourselves. Ata ha'ish. Ata isha, you are the man, you are the woman. We have to be able to be self-critical so that we might emerge as better people. Let this meditation tonight and this Shabbat be a chance for us to work on that, being better people. Breathe in Shabbat.
Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Baruch Shem Kevoy Shem Kevoy Malchuto Leolam ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך, ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובישעריך.
This song by Holly Near reminds all of us that we can have a powerful role in Tikkun Olam, in making the world a better place by admitting our pain and by joining together to cease causing pain to others.
We are open and we are willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors us who go before us, so lift us up to the light of change. We are open and we are willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us, so lift us up to the light of change. There is hurting in our family, and there is sorrow in our towns. There is panic all across the nation, and there is wailing the whole world round.
We are
Open and we are willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. These honors those who go before us, so lift us up to the light of change. May the children see more clearly. May the elders be more wise. May the winds of change caress us, even though it burns around.
We are
Open and we are willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us, so lift us up to the light of change. Give us a mighty yoke to hold our confusion. Give us a desert to hold our fears. Give us a sunset to hold our wonder. Give us an ocean to hold our tears. We are open and we are willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us, so lift us up to the light of change.
we turn to think of those who are ill. We turn in our minds to give strength and hope to those who suffer from illness and from psychological pain as well. We think of so many who have been infected by COVID-19 in our own country and around the world, and the seeming impossibility of slowing down that curve. It's because people aren't willing. We need to be hopeful, and we need to be willing, and we need to be changing. Now, most of the people I'm talking to right now, you wear masks, you social distance, you wash your hands, you're very careful. But there are people in our families and among our friends who are carrying this disease. They are being carefree, but they are carriers. We have to reach out and talk to them. We can save lives. So we turn in our hearts to think of those who are facing illness. We wish them a refuah shlema as our young cantors lead us in Mishaberach. We join together for Kiddush, Motzi, and Motziyah.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen.
L'chaim. And we join together for the traditional blessing over bread and the modern egalitarian blessing over bread. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz. Nevarech et ein hachayim, hamotziyah lechem min haaretz. We hope you'll all stay tuned after a reading and then Mourner's Kaddish. We hope you'll all stay tuned to hear Dr. Jackson Katz, my interview with Dr. Jackson Katz, an expert on masculinity. We're going to be talking about toxic masculinity, about police, rogue police. We're talking about gang violence, white supremacists, the whole gamut of ways in which distorted masculinity manifests itself. We're talking about Me Too and how men can be allies of women in the struggle for equality and respect. And we'll come out of the interview with a sense of what parents can do to raise strong and healthy and loving girls and boys who become women and men. We turn to page 11, and we read these words from Judy Chicago to remind us of the world that we want to create. And then all that has divided us will merge, and then compassion will be wedded to power, and then softness will come to a world that is harsh and unkind. And then both men and women will be gentle. And then both women and men will be strong. And then no person will be subject to another's will. And then all be rich and free and varied. And then the greed of some will give way to the needs of many. And then all will share equally in the earth's abundance. And then all will care for the sick and the weak and the old. And then all will nourish the young. And then all will cherish life's creatures. And then all will live in harmony with each other and the earth. And then everywhere will be called Eden once again. We rise, page 11, Kaddish Yatom, Mourner's Kaddish. We think of all those who have tragically passed away from COVID-19 in our country and around the world, and how this epidemic needs to be slowed down. We think of people on a yard site, loved ones, on the anniversaries of their death. We think of people who have passed away recently, how much they've meant to us. And we think of everyone who is no longer in life, who's dear to us, perhaps parents who raised us to be egalitarian, to see equality, and to work for it as well. For all those whom we remember, Zichronam Livracha, their memories are a blessing to us all. We join together. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah, b'alma divrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon uv'yomechon uv'chayei t'chol Beit Yisrael, b'gala v'zman kari v'imru amen. Yehi shmei Rabbah mevarach li'olam u'lamei maya, Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitalev v'yitalal shmei kudsha brichu, le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechemata, damiran b'yama v'imru amen. Yehi shalom Rabbah min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'imromav, Hu yaseh shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael, v'al kol yoshvei tevel, v'imru amen. We join together singing words of peace, aleinu and us, v'al kol Yisrael, on our people, v'al kol yoshvei tevel, and all the inhabitants of the earth.
Oseh shalom b'imromav, Hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'al kol yoshvei tevel, v'yimru
When we think of heroic men, examples of what a man can be, we think of Congressman John Lewis, who passed away a week ago. We say Zichrono Livracha. May his memory be a blessing to us all. And now we invite you to join to hear the interview with Jackson Katz, but how all of us can live up to the example of being fully human. Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Thanks for being with us. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
I'm so glad that Jackson Katz is here with us for Shabbat tonight. He is a former member of University Synagogue, and we miss him. He now lives on the East Coast, but we hope one day he'll come back. He has spoken at our congregation before. He is a major figure and thought leader in the growing global movement of men working to promote gender equality and prevent gender violence. He's co-founder of the multiracial mixed gender Mentors in Violence Prevention program, one of the longest running and most influential gender violence prevention initiatives in North America and beyond. He's the author of 2 acclaimed books, including The Macho Paradox, Why Some Men Hurt Women, and How All Men Can Help, and creator of the award-winning Tough Guys educational documentary series. His TEDx talk, Violence Against Women is a Men's Issue, has over 4.5 million views, and he has lectured and trained in all 50 states, 8 Canadian provinces, and every continent except Antarctica. So, Shabbat Shalom to you, Jackson. Welcome. We're just delighted to have you here for services tonight. You've said that you don't like the term toxic masculinity. So can you explain why?
Sure. First, Rabbi Rocklis, let me just say this is a great honor for me to be in this context and be having this interview with you. And my family and I had a great experience for almost 20 years in Southern California as members of your congregation. And we miss you and Rudy and and Sue and the educational system and program. And our son Judah had a great Jewish education as a result of our participation in the congregation. So thank you.
We miss all of you as well.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't like the term toxic masculinity for a number of reasons, just a couple of highlights of why. One is that I think a lot of people hear the term and they think it means that we're saying, or that the person saying the word or the phrase is implying that to be male or to be a man is toxic unto itself. I mean, that's a misread of the term, but it's how some people read it. That's one reason why I don't like it, because I don't want to alienate people automatically. If you say something like we have challenges in the way that we define manhood, it's more welcoming, although it's still challenging, than using the word toxic, which is a poison. It's like a poison metaphor. And my goal and a lot of the work that I do is to try to get more men to engage in these conversations, not to push them away. So that's one of the reasons, even though I understand that it's a useful term in other ways. The other thing is I don't like the mixed metaphor of a biological term, toxicity, implying that it's an organism that's invaded by some poisonous agent, and then masculinity, which is a social construction, or it's not a biological reality. It's something that societies and cultures create. And masculinity itself, for example, is widely variable across the world, across history. In the same society, there are different subcultural definitions of masculinity. Masculinity is a very fluid concept, but it's not a biological fixed reality. And so if you combine a biological metaphor with a sociological term, I think you have an oxymoronic or a self-contradictory term, and I just don't like to use it for that reason.
Well, many people watching this are raising Jewish children and raising Jewish boys, parents and grandparents of those Jewish boys. And because the definition of masculinity is so fluid and varied, what would you say to parents and grandparents if they have the joy and privilege of raising children? What would you say to them if they're raising boys? How to raise them in a way that they can understand the full spectrum of masculinity and not have to box them in?
Yes, this is one of the critical questions of our time, and honestly, it's a global question. I mean, I know we'll get specific, but I think this is one of the big challenges of our species at this time in history. It's a big challenge, and I mean, it seems like a cliche, but it does take a village to raise a child. The individual parents can have an enormous impact, and I know that myself and my wife, Shelley, and I mean, obviously we're doing our best. Everybody who's a parent, or not just parents, but, mentors and other figures adult figures in boys' or girls' lives have enormous responsibility and enormous influence. But the whole culture is out there socializing our kids, and the sports culture, the media culture, the porn culture, the military. This, in that sense, the obviously the educational system and the political culture. All of this has shapes sort of norms that our sons, if you want to talk about our sons, are absorbing. Their peer culture has enormous influence, for example, on what they think is normative. So I would say it's critical, and you've said this in your own way for decades and decades, as in your rabbinical teaching and community leadership. You try to instill or hope to instill in them a set of values about dignity of all people and respect and compassion and self-reflection and all these other sort of human qualities that are way more important than any specific gender qualities. Because the most important human qualities. The most important qualities for a man or a woman or somebody who's not a man or woman are not really gender qualities, they're human qualities. And so I think if we start with that as the predicate, which is we're trying to raise boys with a sense of compassion, dignity, self-respect, respect for others, golden rule stuff, then the other stuff will be not easy, but it'll flow after that.
Well, society tells us things like, men like football. Men like to drink beer. Men don't want to wear masks during the COVID-19 pandemic. That kind of virility that is so stereotyped and so exclusive that doesn't allow a wider spectrum of behavior and belief and attitude. How do we overcome that if the society has and peers have such an enormous influence?
Well, true. Well, one way, I'm not saying, again, this is not the only answer to this question, because these are a big question, right? And these are big challenges that we face. But these notions of what is stereotypically masculine or feminine are historically contingent. They're not fixed in nature or in time or in history in any way. So I'll just give you a couple examples. People think pink is a girl's color and blue is a boy's color. But up until the 19th century, pink was a boy's color. Like high heels, a lot of people think that stereotypically women wear high heels. Well, high heels was a fashion pioneered by aristocratic white men in Europe in the 16th century. High heels. And yet today we think of high heels as a more stereotypically feminine affectation, even if the person wearing them is not a biological female. This is the idea that somehow there's this fixed idea of what is masculine and what is feminine is silly. And we know more than that. And so I would say in this era, which is one of the challenges of this era, is that over the past half century, the changes have happened so rapidly in what it means to be, quote unquote, a man, a woman, a sexual being, with the LGBTQ revolution on top of the feminist revolution, which is itself on top of the civil rights movement, which is making us look much more critically at race and ethnicity and inequality in those realms. All of this means that people trying to raise healthy boys today and Jewish boys, and obviously I can't say I was a healthy boy, but I was a Jewish boy. I'm trying to raise a healthy Jewish boy. It's all, we have to take all this into account and try to figure out how do you take the best of the past, just like Reconstructionist Judaism. How do you take the best of the past and certain definitions of manliness that were productive and positive, like, taking care of yourself and your family, being responsible, being dutiful. All these things are good things, and working hard. All this is part of the traditional idea of manhood. But then building onto that, some of the other qualities that women have stereotypically been associated with, and that feminists have critiqued as a problem that only women were identified with, like caring and compassion and vulnerability and emotional presence and emotional literacy. These are skills, human skills, that historically in our society, boys and men were socialized not to have those skills. And you look around and look at all the dysfunctional masculinity everywhere you look, in part because so many boys and men have been socialized in these really narrow ways that because so many people have been obsessed with keeping boys and men in this narrow box, what you see around you in the world and in this society is the results of that. So many boys and men acting out violently, abusively towards others, towards themselves. Violent masculinity and dysfunctional masculinity is so pervasive in the world. One of the reasons is because of this a narrow idea of manhood that is from the beginning, from the childhood, from infancy even, parents and others and the society at large helping to funnel boys into these narrow definitions that are counterproductive and harm them as well as others.
So let's talk about Me Too. Clearly, it's a revolution, I mean, built on feminism, built on civil rights as well, built on an awareness that women don't have to take it anymore. And all of these cases that have their beginnings 10, 15, 20 years ago, the Harvey Weinstein type of assaults and rapes. So Me Too, as a movement, its time certainly has come. It also feels threatening to some men because some men will say things like, well, I thought that was acceptable in 1990. Why am I being punished for that now? And, women come back and say, well, you might have thought that, but I was violated by you. So how do we deal with that?
Well, you have a gift for asking these incredibly great and difficult questions. I think that's one of the major questions of our time, to be quite honest with you, especially as it relates to relations between the genders, is how do you reconcile the new social norms that have been developing? And by the way, the reason why Me Too happened is because of social media. There was a lot of people, a lot of women, and a lesser number of men who for decades have known how big a problem men's violence against women is, sexual harassment in the workplace is. We didn't need the Me Too movement to teach us that. What Me Too movement did was using the technologies of communication and the internet and, obviously social media to give the voice to women and girls all over the world. And I often say that the women who speak up today are not just speaking for other women and girls who might not have a voice today. They're also speaking for billions of women and girls who lived and died in the world over the past, 2,000 or 5,000 years or 10,000 years who never had a voice. So it's really pretty incredible thing. But I would say that how do you reconcile the new norms today with the way things used to be done, and then how do you come to terms with that? And who's the arbiter? Who decides when, for example, a man can be given a pass, or not just a pass, or brought back into community, if you will, if he's transgressed, if that transgression was never punished or never even identified at the time as a transgression, but the new norms have created this new understanding of it as a transgression retroactively. These are the questions that are being litigated and will be litigated for decades. And I have to say, the interesting conversation that's now happening about race and racial justice, prompted by the activists, young people and others out in the streets, and obviously propelled by the police killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th, this big discussion about racism and how do you come to terms with racism. And I would say we have to have this conversation about anti-Semitism. And Germany has been having that conversation about anti-Semitism well before the United States was having that conversation about anti-Black racism. There's lots of overlaps here because, for example, white people who never saw themselves as racist or as participating in a racist system and are offended by the idea, or Gentiles who didn't feel like they were part of an anti-Semitic society, but the more they learn and understand about how their society works, they realize, yes, they were part of that. All of these have overlaps, and all of them have their own unique challenges at the same time. And so I think that's part of what we have to have. That's why I think it's important for men, to be honest with you, for men to have these conversations, both with each other, but also with women. And I think men have to have the courage to face some uncomfortable truths and to step into some uncomfortable spaces and say, you know what, I hear you. Maybe what my behavior, I do need to look critically at my behavior. It doesn't mean I'm a bad person, but it means that I'm a person who grew up in a culture that normalized certain kinds of, sexist behaviors, and I participated in them. And by the way, I think it's important for me to say, as well as anybody, self-righteousness doesn't go anywhere. I would never say that I'm perfect. I would never say, in fact, I've never met a man in my whole life who I could say is a model of the perfect sort of man who's never had a sexist thought, never acted out in some sexist way. That's not, I don't think that's possible. I think that's like a utopian ideal rather than a reality. And we have to get, in that sense, we have to give each other a little bit of a break. Yes, we're going to be imperfect. Yes, we're going to make mistakes. But I would say the direct analogy is with these other issues like racism and anti-Semitism.
What can men now do to be better allies to women in the ongoing struggle for gender equality?
Well, simply stated, we need more men who are willing to step up and stand up and speak out and use their platform of influence, whatever that is. Not everybody has the same level of influence as yourself, for example, or someone like myself. But whatever sphere of influence they have, if you're a man and you have a sphere of influence in your family, in your workplace, in your community, I mean, and then maybe even on a larger stage, what can you do to advance gender justice, gender equality? How can you challenge other men when they act out in sexist ways instead of being silent in the face of it? Just like a white person, if you yourself don't feel like you're participating actively in racist behavior, what are you doing when other white people around you are doing that? And not just on the micro level, because I think a lot of people think about, well, if I see somebody telling a racist joke, I'm going to say something. Or if I see some act of racism, I'm going to intervene. But it's bigger than that, because that's only the micro sort of retail end. What about how are you using your privilege? How are you using whatever social privilege you have? Because if you have, for example, if you're a man and you yourself don't harm women and girls, and you feel like you're respectful in your treatment of girls and women, but you don't do anything else to create a culture where men are held accountable for being abusive towards girls and women, you don't figure out a way to use your influence to lift up women and to change policies in your workplace, for example, that enhance the promotion of girls and women. If you don't do something, I mean, there's so many examples of how, and by the way, let me just say, many men are already doing this. And I think it's important to say this is prospective. We need a lot more, but there's a lot of men who have, like yourself, done a lot already, and we need to, acknowledge that. But I don't think it's enough, and I think it's only a fraction of us men who have been in the world, not just in our society, who have been actively taking the risks of being a leader on this subject matter. And I think that's got to change.
I feel for teenagers who feel the peer pressure to be like the men of old, right? They're just discovering their sexuality and their power, and they are challenged by their peers to not have this kind of regard for women, right? The culture conspires to, if you treat women equally, you are in the same way that someone might be called a traitor to their race, they're a traitor to their gender. They're cowardly. There are all those words in relation to being gay that are thrown at them, right? They're perceived to be weak. How do you help a teenager, which is actually an interesting question, given the fact that you have a teenage boy, how do you help a teenager resist peer pressure and act responsibly with teenage girls and women?
Well, I would say the first thing is that we need teenage boys and young men need to see adult men taking risks in their own peer culture. In other words, instead of thinking that peer pressure is only a phenomenon of, for example, adolescence, it's also for adulthood. There's plenty of adult men who are very nervous about how other adult men think of them around this subject matter. And if we're going to expect our 15-year-old boys, 13-year-old boys, 17-year-old boys to take risks in challenging their peers and working closely and collaboratively with girls in ways that might get them, either criticized or ribbed by their friends. If we're going to expect them to do that, and we ourselves, those of us who are adult men, aren't willing to take the risk in our own peer cultures, I think we're kidding ourselves. So I would say that boys need to see adult men doing it and make it, therefore it takes some of the pressure off of them. I would also say that we need to say it as loud as we can and as often as we can, that a boy or a young man or an adult man who stands with women for gender justice and for women's rights and for reducing men's violence against women is not weak or cowardly. It's the exact opposite. It takes much more strength on the part of a man or a young man to stand with women as their partners and allies, to challenge the culture of sexism, than it does to go along and be one of the guys. I mean, being one of the guys is the easiest thing in the world to do if you're a guy. What takes something special is the guy who turns to his friend and says, hey, dude, the way you're talking about women here, that's not cool with me. The guy might get ridiculed in the moment. Oh, what are you, Mr. Politically Correct? What are you, some virtue signaler? What are you, soft? But the reality is the guy who just said the comment that, you can't be sexist or I don't appreciate sexism is actually evidencing way more strength of character and and even sometimes courage than the guy who's calling him soft or weak.
So let's talk about bystander culture. Male bystander culture. When Derek Chauvin put his knee on George Floyd and killed him, there were 3 other cops who were standing there who didn't want to break the code of silence that police have with each other. They didn't want to step forward, perhaps because they would be perceived to be not just traitors to the police, but traitors to their masculinity. Yeah. So let's talk about that in the George Floyd case, but also in a much wider circle of bystanders, people who are indifferent, people who could intervene, but stand by.
Absolutely. And can I just say, in preface to that answer, to the specifics of the George Floyd murder in Minneapolis, I'm one of the architects, the original architects of what's called the bystander approach to sexual assault prevention and domestic violence prevention. Back in the early 90s, when I started the program that I created in Boston at the Center for the Study of Sport and Society, called the Mentors in Violence Prevention, or MVP program, we were the first program to employ this bystander approach. And the whole idea was, and we borrowed it, we imported it from middle school bullying initiatives that a professor of mine in graduate school and some of his colleagues were working on. And we imported it from middle school bullying into the domestic and sexual violence area. And the reason why we did this, and I was, obviously on this, was that I was trying to figure out, how do we get men who are not themselves abusive, who don't harass or abuse women, how do we get those men to see this as their issue? Because a lot of men will say, in response to the issues of sexual violence and domestic violence, I don't rape women, I don't hurt women, I don't mistreat my girlfriend or my wife. Why are you talking to me? This is not my issue. And I was trying to figure out, how do we speak to those men? So this bystander approach, which middle school bullying prevention people were employing, was a way of saying that it's not just about the perpetrator and the victim, it's about everybody in the group. What about the people around the perpetrator, the kid who's doing the bullying? What about the kids around the kid experiencing it? What role do they have to play? And I think, and I have to say, being Jewish was an important part of why I was immediately on this, because of the whole, growing up knowing that there was a whole country of tens of millions of people that was complicit in their either silence or, in some cases, active participation in the brutal anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany and the pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe. In other words, the bystander concept. What are the good people remaining silent in the face of abuse are in some ways morally culpable for the perpetration of those abuses. And so the bystander approach, as it applies to men and young men around issues of sexual and domestic violence, is how do you get guys to make it clear to other guys that harming girls and women and other boys and men is not just an issue between the two parties, but you're violating all of us. You're violating our shared, if it's a workplace, for example, if you're harassing a woman, you're a man and you're harassing a woman in the workplace, you're not just hurting her, you are hurting her, but you're also violating the shared values of that workplace, which says we treat each other with respect and dignity, and this is a healthy and safe workplace. You're actually violating all of our sort of values, not just hurting that one person. When it comes to the George Floyd case, I immediately, as soon as I heard about this or saw the video, I was like, oh my God, this is a textbook case. And I wrote a piece about this in Ms. Magazine about connecting this whole bystander concept in the George Floyd case with this, what I was just talking about, which is domestic and sexual violence. There are so many important dynamics that happen in male peer cultures, including in police culture. And I've worked a long time with police and law enforcement, and even more so in the U.S. military and the Australian military. I mean, extensively. So I know these dynamics like in these peer cultures. And for example, there's hierarchy within peer cultures. They're not, Derek Chauvin, for example, was a 19-year veteran of the Minneapolis police force. One of the officers was on his 4th day on the job. 4th day. 2 of them, including that man, were rookies. And one of them was on his 4th day on the job. And Derek Chauvin was actually an instructor. He was a trainer of police in police procedure. So these young guys who are, in some cases, completely green or new on the job are now being faced with this kind of tough guy who comes onto the scene, takes charge, enacts his behavior, and they have to make a decision at that moment. And I'm not defending them. I think I'm trying to understand them. They have to make a decision. If they don't like what's happening, what are they going to do? And what are the risks that they encounter if they do something? Now, I know that people hearing from the outside will say, I don't care what dynamics are going on here. This guy was being murdered in cold blood on the street, and these guys were in a position to do something, and they didn't do anything. And they, and they need to pay. I mean, that's the kind of, I appreciate that's the kind of animosity coming their way. But I think we're naive if we think that these dynamics aren't real. And I think what happens in that moment, like say at the moment of truth, in that 8 minutes and 46 seconds or what have you, is these men have to make a decision. If, by the way, if they are uncomfortable with what's going on. Now, I'm not saying that all of them necessarily were. That'll be litigated, to be honest with you. And one of them did ask Derek Chauvin to move a couple times, and he didn't. But I think what happens is a moment of truth where guys have to decide, do I do what's right, what I know is right, but there's going to be consequences if I do it. I'm going to be seen as not loyal to the group. I'm going to be seen as taking the side against my fellow police officer. There's a brotherhood, if you will, and women are in that, are pulled into that in their own way in the police culture. But there is a certain kind of sense of embattled minority subculture that if you take an opposing point of view, that something that they're doing is wrong, that you will be seen as disloyal, and you could be fired, you could lose your job, you could lose status within your peer culture. And I think a lot of guys, either consciously or unconsciously, decide, you know what, I'm just going to, I don't really want to deal with this, I'm just going to put my head down. And the result is you have a lot, like in the George Floyd case, you have a death of a murder of a man, you have one guy facing, multiple life in prison, a deep sentence, and the other 3 facing criminal charges, and the whole country going up in flames as a result of their inability in that short moment to make a better and a more courageous moral choice. But I do want to say, it's not, from the outside, it's easier to see why and how somebody should have acted than it is in the moment. And I do believe that happens every day on college campuses and in workplaces where people do see behavior that they know is not cool, that they figure out a way not to do anything because they've made the conscious or unconscious decision that the costs of doing something are too high that they don't want to pay.
Well, let's talk about violent masculinity. It happens in the hood, in gangs, and it happens with white supremacists. When I think of white supremacists, although I know there are women involved, when you see these documentaries, it's generally men. It's often, men in their 20s, mentored by older white supremacists, the neo-Nazis. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it is identified with masculinity, mm-hmm. not just with whiteness in the case of white supremacists. So what can we do about violent masculinity, whether it's in inner city crime areas and gangs, or it's in white supremacist murderous gangs as well?
Absolutely. I think the unifying theme is that it's about gender, it's about masculinity, and it's about masculinities. And it's been an interest of mine for my entire life, sort of violent masculinities, and certainly, for example, white violent masculinity. I mean, to me, the neo-Nazi movements and the quote-unquote white nationalist or white supremacist movements in the United States and in Europe are all about white masculinity. They're not just about whiteness, as you correctly identify. In fact, one of the frustrating things for me is that so much of the discourse about the rise of white nationalism in the United States and Europe over the past decade is just centered on anti-immigration sentiment and the racial and ethnic integration that's happening in our society and the resistance to that. To me, it's equally about men feeling dispossessed and losing out in an era of feminism and women's ascension and LGBT ascension, and white men's panic and frustration an aggrieved entitlement. In other words, they feel like the society should be theirs. They should have inherited the central part of the society that they think was their inheritance. It's not succeeding for them, and they're angry, and they want to find scapegoats to blame. But I don't think this is a coincidental or an incidental or a marginal point. I think it's essentially about not just whiteness, but about white masculinity. With gangs, I mean, it's still about masculinity, but it's more complicated because it's the racial and ethnic piece is a little more complicated. I think a lot of why young men join gangs is for a feeling of belonging. It's sometimes for protection. Sometimes the route in is they get intimidated, they get blackmailed, they get sort of coerced into it, and then once they've committed acts to put themselves at jeopardy from the law, there's a series of ways in which they're kept in that space. But I think a big part of the attraction of gangs, like street gangs, is a sense of belonging and a sense of validation of their manhood, especially for boys and young men who don't have other means of validating their identity as men, because they're, to say the least, some of them very poor, marginal economically. They don't have the educational attainment or the realistic expectation of, a good job or career. They're not even thinking in those terms, but they want to be respected. And the currency of respect on the streets is violence, especially for men, not exclusively, but especially for men. And so you see this all over the world. You see boys and young men who are from dispossessed communities who want to be respected, and they see that the quickest path to gain that respect for them, at least as they understand it, is through violence. And it's very sad, because then, of course, that just perpetuates the same, because then they get the response is the state comes down on them, and the violence is everywhere. The state is now employing violence to control them, and people have to raise money, and everybody's less free. And then all the sadness and tragedy that happens as a result of their enactment of violence to be somebody. It's very sad.
Thank you for your time. This has really been a wonderful interview. I'm going to ask you one last question. What do fathers of sons and fathers of daughters need to know about this issue, and what can they do?
Well, I think that we as fathers, and I'd always say mentors, coaches, teachers, uncles, grandfathers. In other words, all the adult men who have some position of influence in the lives of young people. First, we need to figure out how centered we are on all these matters. In other words, the more we're knowledgeable, the more we're self-reflexive or introspective, the more we're willing to be vulnerable or acknowledging vulnerability, the better we are going to be as teachers and mentors to young people. And I often say that, because I think a lot of adult men, and I don't accept myself from this category, a lot of adult men feel like they need to be such the authority when it comes to their interactions with young people, that they feel like they can't acknowledge vulnerability, they can't acknowledge their own weakness or their own lack of knowledge in some way, because they want to pretend that they haven't got it all figured out. I think it's an important thing for an adult, especially an adult man, to say to young people, look, I don't have it all figured out either. I'm trying to figure this out too. I'm trying to figure out how to have good relations with women and be respectful and to myself. I'm trying to do better than my father did, or my stepfather did. And I'm trying to be a healthier human being for you, but it doesn't mean I've got it all figured out. So I would say just being willing to accept that you yourself have to do work on yourself before you can be effective in helping transmit positive values to young people. But I would also say, I would say that that's something that you need to communicate to both girls and boys, which is growth and knowledge acquisition and being a better person is a lifelong process, and we're all part of it. And I would say that that's more important than any of the specifics that we might impart to them.
Well, it was a very profound note to end on. So, Jackson Katz, thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom to you. Thank you for being with us.
Shabbat Shalom to you, Rabbi, too. Thank you.